Welcome to Family Law A to Z with DBD.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Family Law A to Z with DBD, a podcast from the Pennsylvania-based firm Deschel Bartle Dooley. This series reflects the collective experience of the firm's family law team, including attorneys Mark Deschel, Elizabeth Billies, and Katie Lin Daly, who work together closely to provide clear, practical guidance on the legal issues that impact your family and your future. I'm Sean O'Connor, and today we're talking about temporary orders in Pennsylvania divorce and custody cases and why they can be an important part of the legal process. Joining me for this conversation is attorney Katie Lin Daly. Katie focuses exclusively on family law and helps individuals and families navigate divorce, custody, and support matters with a steady, client-centered approach. She's committed to helping people understand the process, make informed decisions, and move forward with clarity. Katie, good to see you. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Let's start with just a very basic question. What is a temporary order in a Pennsylvania family law case?
By the very definition, a temporary order is an order that isn't final. They can be called temporary orders, they could be called interim orders, but the main point of those short-term orders, let's call them, is that they're not the end of any matter. There's going to be further litigation, further hearings, further agreements. A temporary order or an interim order just indicates we're not done with this issue.
And so where are they sort of deployed? What kinds of issues can temporary orders address during a divorce or custody?
There's numerous different issues that a temporary order could be issued in. The kind of most common one that I think of is in a protection from abuse matter, where an interim or a temporary order is entered pending a final hearing. We also see temporary orders in custody cases, in support cases. We'll sometimes see them in divorce cases when we talk about things like exclusive possession, who is living in the marital home. And we also might see them in the more financial areas where we're talking about interim counsel fees or interim expert fees. Those are all very common places where we would have a temporary or an interim order.
Got it. And so when exactly do temporary orders typically become necessary in one of these family law cases?
So there's really two places that I see temporary orders, pop up in cases. The first is in an emergency. There could be a situation, especially a PFA or in custody, where something happens and either of the parents or the children are not safe. And an emergency petition would be filed. A judge would enter a temporary order to keep everybody safe until we can figure out what's going on. So an emergency would be the first place that I see temporary orders. The second place a temporary order is most common in is at the beginning of the case. Maybe parents just separated and we don't have a custody schedule yet. We don't know where the children are going to live.
Right.
So you'll have a temporary order to sort of bridge the gap until we figure out what's best for the kids and for the family.
How does it get initiated? Like what's the process for getting an order created?
The court is never just going to, on its own, issue an order. Someone in the case needs to ask for something. So the way an interim or a temporary order would be entered is the party who's requesting that relief would file a petition. They would file a petition for protection from abuse. They would file an emergency custody petition. They would file a support complaint. They would file a petition for special relief for exclusive possession or for fees and costs. It has to be asked for before the court can grant it.
Okay, so it gets initiated, petition for. Is there a typical sort of by the book time limit, or is it just case by case dependent?
So the court will tend to act very quickly when someone's physical safety is at risk or their mental, emotional safety is at risk. So by way of example, in a PFA or in a custody case where there's allegations of abuse, the court will act really quickly. And if on the facts that the court has received, the court can perceive that there is a risk of harm, they will enter an emergency order within a day or so.
Oh, wow.
Now, some of the financial issues, exclusive possession, support, attorney's fees, the court is not necessarily going to enter those on an emergency basis unless maybe, a house is going into foreclosure or there's a real risk of harm that's open. So, depending on the level of harm is how quickly the court is going to act.
Got it. Got it. And then how long does it stay in effect?
Interesting question. The worst answer that I can give is that it depends, but it depends.
That's
Um,
very common
in
answer, by the way, just so you know. Very common answer.
It's the
It
lawyer
depends.
answer. So, generally, an interim order is in effect until further order of court, which means, you know, essentially nothing. If it's a temporary custody order, it will usually be in effect until a hearing is held. And how long it takes to get a hearing can vary county to county, judge to judge, and case to case. If you have a really complex custody case where there's going to be a lot of witnesses, maybe there's expert testimony, that temporary order could be in effect for a couple of months. Whereas just to kind of contrast, a temporary support order where, you went to a conference, they ran a number, you have a temporary order, and you have a hearing in 4 weeks, that temporary order is going to be a lot shorter than the custody that I just mentioned.
I'm just curious how the court looks on these, right? Could a temporary order influence the, sort of final outcome of a case, or does the court wall them off, so to speak, in their view?
So, kind of a tough question to answer. There's a couple of variables. The first thing is that generally, maybe not generally, but oftentimes temporary orders are entered without prejudice. What that means is that it doesn't necessarily impact the final decision. So, just a quick example, let's say that there's a support order that's temporary, and the temporary support order is, $2,000 a month. And then you go to a hearing and you find out that the final support order is more like $2,500 a month. The court isn't going to say, oh, well, it was 2000, 4 weeks ago, so we're just going to go with 2000. Where it gets a little bit complicated is really in cases like custody, where if there is a temporary order that has been in effect for a really long time, that kind of becomes the status quo. So if
Right.
there was a case where, one parent didn't have custody for 6 months, a year, something like that, the court isn't necessarily going to say, "Okay, well, we'll just keep this in perpetuity." But what they have to acknowledge is that, in this particular case, you have kids who haven't seen a parent for a year. They need to be reacclimated into a more quote unquote normal schedule.
Yeah, I mean, they could be in a different school potentially.
Correct.
Yeah, yeah. The $10,000 question, what happens if someone doesn't follow a temporary order?
So a temporary order has the same impact as a final order. And
Oh,
the powers of the court to enforce orders, a party can be fined, a party can be incarcerated, a party can, get a court order to get the police involved. Just because it's a temporary order doesn't mean it's not a real order. If you receive a temporary order in a family law case, you should follow that order as if it wasn't a temporary order.
got it. Yeah, it still has teeth, so to speak. Yeah, I could see how that would be
Correct.
like, oh, it's just a temporary order. It's not that serious. No, it's just as serious. It just has a shelf life.
Correct.
Yeah,
Temporary orders are really kind of like a band-aid on the situation, and you need that band-aid oftentimes,
yeah.
but it's not, a shortcut to getting an end result.
Okay. All right. That's good to know. What about this? Okay, we've got, listeners out there, obviously. If someone believes a temporary order is, unfair, unjust in some way, or, is no longer an accurate reflection of their circumstances, are there options available to address that situation? Can they petition the court, or, how does that unfold?
So the nature of a temporary order is that something else is going to happen. So generally the language in temporary orders is, until further hearing or until further order of court. So because a temporary order is in effect, that means something is still going to happen. Now, the timeline can be a problem because let's say there's a temporary support order and you're waiting 2 months to get a support hearing and then somebody loses their job in the middle. You can't necessarily wait 2 months at a way too high or a way too low order to get things taken care of. So my recommendation is usually like, let's look at this holistically. Long are we going to wait to be back in court? And if we're not going to be back in court before this needs to be addressed, then we would want to file a petition to modify, or depending on the situation, a new petition alleging new instances.
Ah, like if the situation really had, or the circumstances had really changed dramatically that were going to be somewhat, I'll say, longer term, then it's almost like shaking the Etch-a-Sketch and let's start over
Yeah.
almost. Yeah, interesting. Well, okay, we're up against time, which happens. But thank you so much for being here and sharing your expertise and point of view. I've really enjoyed it, and I look forward to talking in the future.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. That's it for today's episode of Family Law A to Z with DBD. If you'd like to learn more about Katie Lin Daly or the family law team at Deshelle Bartle Dooley, visit their website, dbdlaw.com, for resources and information about Pennsylvania family law matters. Thanks for listening. And, as always, don't forget to leave a review or a thumbs up, or maybe share a link with someone in your world who would benefit from this kind of information. We really appreciate it. I'm Sean O'Connor. Have a great day.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.